The Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to discuss something that has been on my mind, discuss an issue that we've been talking about. We've been holding hearings in both the Budget Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, and that is the state of our economy and what I would characterize as the dire state of our economy, which I believe, and I'll demonstrate with some charts this evening, is due to the reckless budgetary policies of this administration. And what I'm talking about is today we have inflation at 8.6%, which is the highest level in over 40 years. We also have a GDP, or a gross domestic product, the total output of our economy, that is shrinking. In the first quarter, it shrank 1.4%. We may well be on the way to a recession if the second quarter shows that it's shrinking as well. So there's no better time than right now to renew our nation's commitment to fiscal responsibility and to make a difference in the lives of the people that we represent. So let's talk a little bit about inflation. Food prices are up 10.1%. Real wages, that's the difference between inflation and the rise of wages, are down 3.4% as of today, meaning that the average family is facing an effective pay cut of $1,500 just this year. Gas prices, everyone knows gas prices are at their highest ever, with average prices in my hometown of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, now exceeding $5 a gallon. And overall energy costs, home fuel oil and others included, is up 34.6%. And unfortunately, as I'll point out tonight, the spending policies enacted and pushed by the Biden administration and by Democrats in Congress are really responsible for driving inflation and are certainly, even if you don't agree with that, they are certainly saddling future generations with debt. Our kids, someone will pay the price for the massive debt we have now, and unfortunately that will be our kids and grandkids and future generations. You know, it's been said Congress has a habit of only addressing a problem when we reach a crisis, only addressing issues when we reach a crisis. But that crisis may have already begun right now. We're in a pretty tough spot in our economy at the moment, and people are feeling it every single day. So we must step up to begin to address this. You know, every member of Congress, I'm sure, has talked to their constituents and can share stories about how their constituents are impacted by rising prices. I can tell you myself, you know, growing up as a child, I experienced what it was like to have it be difficult for my family to afford food. I was one of 12 kids. My father was first a farmer and a roofer. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. And I can tell you a stressful time for my mother was going to the grocery store. And the reason for that is because she knew she would not have quite enough money to buy everything that she thought she needed. So I remember walking with her up and down the aisles, and she was calculating in her head how much she was putting in the cart, was very concerned that she would get to the register and be embarrassed that she would have to put some things back. And today, people are feeling that. I hear in my district, for instance, my constituent Lamar, he put the impact of inflation in clear terms. He tells me that he spends more now, but has less. He's doing with less. Paul says he's sadly giving up on his hopes of retirement. at this time. Tim said he has to choose between gas and groceries every week. Laverne, 66 years old, had to go back to work to help out his children and his grandchildren now, though the impact of inflation on future debt will mean, as I mentioned earlier, that his grandchildren will be paying the cost of the reckless spending that we're seeing now. They'll be paying for that for decades. So we've all heard from our constituents. We've heard their outcries. We've heard them talk to us about needing to rein in inflation. I think it's time that we take it as a wake-up call. Let's identify the causes of inflation and work to mitigate them. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to get up and speak tonight, because we've had debates in both the committees that I mentioned about the causes of inflation. And that's not just a political debate. It's not just because. It's because the only way we can begin to solve it is to understand the root cause of inflation, what led to where we are now, and then what we can do to change it. It's going to take leadership at all levels of government to address not only inflation, but the $30 trillion now in debt and trillions of dollars in deficits as far as we can see and as far as the Biden budget projects. Now, I'm a business owner, not an economist, so I can't even say that I have all the answers. But what I can tell you is that I believe that capitalism, freedom, free enterprise have made the United States the most powerful nation in the history of the world, has provided more opportunity than ever before in the history of humankind. And I think returning to those core values can help lead us, will help lead us out of this mess. So let's talk, first of all, a chart I want to show you. Inflation, it does not arrive randomly. There are forces that cause inflation. Every time we've seen inflation in our history, there are forces that cause it. And in this case, we've had things that are outside of our control, and Democrats will argue the president blames inflation on COVID-19, supply chain disruptions, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the big bad oil and gas companies, and other things. I don't know what the next thing is that he'll be blaming inflation on. But I agree, they certainly have played a role in causing inflation. However, those challenges are the same challenges that every other country across the world has faced. And they do not explain why inflation in the United States spiked earlier and is much worse than what we are seeing in other countries. This chart shows the annual core CPI inflation compared to OECD, which is sort of peer countries, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development countries. And it shows how inflation spiked starting roughly the beginning of 2021 and far exceeded that of comparable countries. So what caused that? Well, I have another chart that puts a little finer point on this. And this shows that inflation started about the time that Biden took office and really accelerated after the passing of the American Rescue Plan, which put trillions of dollars in spending into our economy. Now, I showed that chart today in a hearing and budget to Mr. Stephen Moore of the Save America Coalition, and he agreed that the clear difference between what we saw in the past chart, the blue line, and the other countries, the clear difference was the stimulus that was provided, the increase in demand that was provided by inserting trillions of dollars into the U.S. economy through the American Rescue Plan Act. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, I have an article I'd like to insert into the record, if I may. I wrote an op-ed that was published in The Hill on how President Biden's policies have caused and will further fuel inflation. I'd like to submit that for the record, if I may.
Without objection.
Thank you, sir. So again, March 2021, the Biden administration, congressional Democrats, rammed through $1.9 trillion in deficit spending. And by the way, and only a small portion of that really went to solving problems and helping people that needed help through the pandemic, that helped to defeat the pandemic. So much of this was not needed and only served to fuel inflation. And by the way, they were warned by many economic experts. We warned them. Republicans on the committees, both Budget and Ways and Means, warned Democrats at the time this was passed in early 2021 that we would see exactly this result. And we were relying on the forecasts of many economists who were saying exactly that, who were warning the administration of that at the time. Not just Republican economists, by the way. There's a name that many of you will know. Former Obama and Clinton economist, Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, warned that the American Rescue Plan would be the biggest macroeconomic mistake in 40 years, and it would cause inflationary pressures of a kind that we have not seen in a generation. Again, Larry Summers, very well-respected Democrat administration, economists, warning that we would be seeing the inflation that we're seeing now over a year ago when the American Rescue Plan was passed. Just recently, a study by the San Francisco Federal Reserve confirms that prediction, attributing the American Rescue Plan for at least 3 points of the current 8.6%. Mark Goldwyn of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, CRFB, described the American Rescue Plan as, and I quote, pouring gasoline on the fire in terms of an already overstimulated economy. And in my discussion with CBO Director Philip Swagel during our House Budget Committee hearing last month, he also agreed, head of CBO, that the American Rescue Plan Act pumped trillions of dollars into the economy that artificially fueled demand and ultimately drove today's inflation crisis. So what happened? We had far too much cash in the economy, far too much demand, to the point, and I want to show you something that my governor in Pennsylvania said, Governor Wolf. He tweeted he wanted to send more money to people all across Pennsylvania. After jobs are open, people are back to work. Because he said, and I quote, and you see it on the quote here, states are swimming with cash. They have an unusual problem in Pennsylvania right now today. This is the week they're finishing the Pennsylvania budget, and they have more money than they know what to do with. And much of that came as a result of the American Rescue Plan and was excess money that wasn't needed in the economy. Those funds would have been far better used paying down the deficit, paying down the debt, and not fueling inflation by artificially boosting demand. So it really is unfortunate because this hurts my constituents, hurts people all across the country, that the White House did not heed the call of experts sooner and did not take steps to reduce the impact of inflation. For a while, the White House instead said that inflation would be transitory. And now just recently, Secretary of the Treasury Yellen, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell backed off that argument and agreed that they were wrong. Inflation was not transitory, and we have a real problem dealing with inflation at this point. Secretary Yellen said in a Ways and Means hearing just last week, and I quote, "I think I was wrong then about the path that inflation could take." The sad thing about inflation, one of the sad things about inflation, is that it impacts different people differently. And the White House has claimed that inflation are high-class woes reserved for the rich, the economy's challenges that we're seeing today. But instead, it's the people on the lower end of the economic scale who are making less money, who are impacted more than any others by inflation. The Penn-Wharton budget model concluded that inflation disproportionately impacts lower-income Americans who have to pay an even higher percentage of their income on necessities like food and transportation, the price increases for which outpace the general inflation rate. As I mentioned earlier, the White House tries to blame multiple sources: corporate greed, gas companies, Russia, whatever it may be, as a source of inflation. But I think that only serves to deflect blame, obscure the truth, and prevent us from coming to an agreement where we can then begin to solve this. I think the president became more interested in inflation after he's seeing his plummeting approval rates. He's now talking about inflation being as a top priority of the administration. He, in fact, just recently wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled, "My Plan for Fighting Inflation." I'd like to talk just briefly about that. He begins the op-ed by arguing that our economy is actually in great shape, which strikes me as being about as out of touch as you can get. He apparently isn't talking to the constituents that I talk to on a regular basis. And he lays out then 3 points for combating inflation. 1, well, it's the Fed's job. 2, his energy policies and Build Back Better agenda will fix it. And 3, a supposed newfound commitment to fiscal discipline. And in the op-ed, he says he welcomes debate on his plan. And maybe tonight that's what we're doing. We're debating what really are the ways that we can combat inflation and whether his plan really will work. So let's talk about the Fed, because the president, first point was arguing that it's the Fed's responsibility to control inflation. And the president, again, has spent a year and a half pushing policies that fuel inflation and then points to the Fed to fix the problem. Now, I do agree that the Fed has a role in controlling inflation. And essentially the tool they have will be to raise interest rates, to try to slow down the economy. But we all know that raising rates, which will be required, which they're doing now, tomorrow they're talking about a 0.75% increase in the federal rate, which is a significant increase, and they're talking about doing that multiple times. So it has significant consequences on our economy, both in the short and long term. What do I mean by that? Well, it makes it more expensive for businesses to borrow money. It makes it more expensive for individuals to borrow money. We're seeing home mortgage rates go up significantly already. That will continue to do that. And hundreds of thousands fewer people today are able to afford to buy a home, and when they could have done so when the rates were lower. So there'll be a decrease in demand for goods and services, which again, it's an attempt to tamp down the economy, to decrease demand and decrease spending. But the other entity that's affected by rising interest rates is the Fed, the the government. You know, we have $30 trillion in debt. And for this chart shows what will happen as interest rates are being raised. Just raising 0.5%, if you see the first line, will increase interest costs over the next 10 years by $1.3 trillion. Going up 2% will increase interest costs by $5.3 trillion over the next 10 years. Now let's put that in perspective. That would be, under the president's plan, 1.5 times our current Medicare spending, 1.4 times our current defense spending, and 11 times our current veterans' health care spending. So every single dollar that we have to pay in additional interest costs will be taking dollars from programs that help people across the country and will be taking dollars out of our economy. Increasing national debt is also a threat to our national security. And Mr. Speaker, if I can introduce another article. I also wrote an op-ed in May that was published in the Washington Times, and I'd like to introduce into the record, if I may.
Without objection.
Laying out how increased inflation causes interest rates to rise, which ultimately undermines our national security. China, perhaps our greatest adversary of the next decade, now owns $1.1 trillion of the national debt. That's the second highest total among foreign sovereign governments, and increased dependence on China is a clear threat to our national security. If the current trends continue, China's portion of our national debt will increase to $1.7 trillion over the next decade. Interest payments, as they rise, will mean more income for China and will directly fuel China's growth, making them a stronger economic and military adversary. 12 years ago, Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Admiral Michael Mullen famously warned, and I quote, "The most significant threat to our national security is our debt," unquote. That was 12 years ago. Most significant threat to our national security is our national debt. At that time, by the way, the nation's federal debt was roughly $13.5 trillion. Now it's at $30 trillion and growing. What could be even worse is if our lenders lose faith in the ability of the United States to pay back, make good on those loans, essentially lose faith in the credit of the United States. That would be what we call a sovereign debt crisis, a major economic impact in the United States, affecting every single American. And by the way, that's not merely a hypothetical. We've seen major nations face sovereign debt crises. In 2009, Greece's budget deficits totaled 12.7% of its GDP. By 2012, Greece's debt to GDP ratio was 160%. Under CRFB's analysis, our debt, held by the public, will reach 126% of GDP by 2032 with the anticipated increased interest rates. That has put us well on the way, if we don't change this trajectory, put us well on the way to fiscal calamity like Greece has experienced just not long ago, just a few years ago. So it's long past time for the U.S. to get our fiscal house in order and abandon the reckless budgetary policies that sunk the Greek economy at that time. Let's talk just briefly about energy. It's another big factor in the rising prices that we're seeing. And this chart sort of blows me away. Average prices of gas in my hometown right now exceed $5 a gallon. Like, think about that. Just a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, like, no one would have imagined that we would be spending $5 per gallon. And you see the same kind of increases in home fuel, heating costs, and so on. And the president blames oil and gas markets for that high inflation rate, and he focuses on the role of Russia in driving those. But you know what's amazing? Under President Trump, when President Biden took office, our nation was energy independent, becoming a net exporter of oil in 2019. And some of the very first actions that President Biden took were to halt drilling on federal lands, to stop the Keystone Pipeline. And even as prices went up, the administration doubled down on limiting the supply of our drilling. No new permits improved. So it's a classic economic formula. They dramatically increased demand and reduced supply, which led to the prices that we're seeing now. The president just put out his new budget. And he says now, for really the first time, I think, since he's been in office, that it's important to reduce deficits. I welcome that. I think it is important that we reduce deficits. We have to reduce the debt long term. And he claims credit for reducing the federal deficit by $1.7 trillion this year due to the expiration of spending in the American Rescue Plan, which, by the way, was all deficit spending. And he says that this reduction demonstrates a newfound commitment to fiscal discipline. Now, let's just look at that for a little bit. Now, if I eat 10,000 calories today, which is way more than I need, and tomorrow I eat 5,000, well, that won't make me a model. Doesn't mean that I'm on any kind of a diet. And when you look at this plan, this is the president's budget straight from his budget documents. I get it. There was an anomaly during COVID. It was a challenge for all of us. And the deficit went way up during COVID. But look at the deficit before COVID, which is the second bar on the left side. And then coming out of COVID, what happens? Do you see, if you take out the 2 COVID years, which was an exception, an anomaly, do you see deficits declining at all? No. In fact, they're going up every single year. That is not fiscal responsibility. In fact, I call it swamp math. To say that we're reducing deficits when this is exactly what it looks like in their budget plan. It's swamp math. You set 1 foot outside the Beltway, and I can tell you, every single American that looks at this does not believe that we're reducing deficits in any way. And I don't mean that as a knock on the administration. Well, I guess I do mean it as a knock on the administration. But what I really mean to say is that we have to get serious about implementing policies that will drive growth and that will result in lower deficits over time, or we will be going down that path of fiscal calamity. Besides this, the other thing that the president is still calling for, is what he calls the Build Back Better plan. And this is outlined in his budget. Now, I call it Build Back Bankrupt because it continues to put us on a path of a potential sovereign debt crisis, certainly continues to build debt for our kids, our grandkids, and future generations. The Build Back Bankrupt plan imposes new taxes, 36 new taxes on Americans, and dramatically increases spending beyond what you see here. This is what they want to do while they're claiming to do this, which they're saying is reducing deficits. Makes no sense whatsoever. And one of the other things I want to mention, I'm running out of time here. It's just been recently that we've had this economy working on all cylinders. And we could be doing that again. This economy could be in a far different position if we implemented policies similar to what were done under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act under the previous administration. Just before COVID hit, we were seeing the impact. Almost every measure you could possibly take showed that the economy was working for the American people. And by the way, middle-income American average household income increased by $6,000 per year. That's a real impact. People were feeling it compared to a $3,500 drop in real wages during this administration. So the TCJA boosted workers' paychecks, income and wealth inequality fell, real wages for the bottom 10%, by the way, grew nearly twice as fast as the top 10%, and real wealth of the bottom 50% of households rose 3 times faster than that of the top 1%. Despite the challenges that we face now, I think hope is not lost. I am optimistic that if we install the right policies, if we implement the right policies, America can once again work for the American people. We need to be committed to that. We need to have a discussion about what policies will work, and we need to stop this massive
The gentleman's
spending
time has
of this
expired.
administration.
Pursuant
Thank
to
you, Mr.
Section
Speaker.
11B of House Resolution 188, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate and noon for legislative business.